thanks very much for having me. So this talk is going to be about what I think is a widely held, though often unexamined, belief that, loosely speaking, moral realism is more defensible than realism with respect to aesthetics. And I'm going to call this claim the Asymmetry Claim. The Asymmetry Claim is sometimes stated explicitly, but others appear to be implicitly committed to it. It's far more often asserted or implicitly assumed than it is argued for in any case. Here I'm going to take issue with the asymmetry claim, and I'm going to do that by identifying what I take to be the main arguments for it. Even when they're stated in a quite abbreviated form, I'm going to try and extract some arguments for it, and then argue that these arguments don't work. So among the relatively few cases in which the asymmetry claim is explicitly argued for, a recurring theme is to appeal to a cluster of related differences and alleged differences, which are taken to strongly suggest a picture whereby aesthetic value is importantly linked to subjective responses, whilst leaving open whether such a picture holds for ethical value. So here I'm going to argue that, contrary to what has been assumed, not all of these alleged differences in fact obtain, whilst those that do obtain are incapable, I'm going to argue, of grounding the asymmetry claim. So I'm going to begin by fleshing out the asymmetry claim in a little bit more detail, and then I'm going to identify 4 alleged differences that either have or might be thought to support the asymmetry claim. And then I'm going to say for each why it fails to support the asymmetry claim. So first of all, I'm going to just make 3 preliminary points. So one about what I mean when I say aesthetic value and aesthetics, one about realism in general, and one about the asymmetry claim more specifically. So first of all, about aesthetic value. The first point to note is that whilst moral realists and anti-realists tend to be largely in agreement about which are the notions whose status they're debating, in aesthetics there are a number of different concepts and different notions about which the question of realism arises. So moral realists and anti-realists take themselves to be disputing the status of claims about the rightness or wrongness of a given action, claims about moral obligation, claims about the goodness or badness of a given state of affairs or a given character trait. And by and large, people tend to think that even if these amount to slightly different things, the meta-ethical position taken on one brings with it the same position with respect to the others. But in aesthetics, on the other hand, the different notions about which the question of realism versus anti-realism arises appear to be a bit more independent of each other. So you can wonder, for example, about whether beauty is entirely in the eye of the beholder, or whether it's a real property out there in the world. And you can also ask whether whether there's a fact of the matter, what is true in a fiction, or what a picture depicts, or whether a musical work expresses a certain emotion. And it's not at all obvious, at least to me, that answering one of these questions settles the answer to all the others, right? So it seems perfectly intelligible that one could take one position with respect to, say, fictional truth, say relativism, and quite another with respect to beauty, say realism. So there's a number of different questions notions for which anti-realism and realism questions arise in aesthetics, and they look to be relatively, at least some of them, independent of each other. Further, many philosophers distinguish between beauty and artistic merit. So beautiful artwork isn't necessarily a good one, and a good artwork isn't necessarily beautiful. So depending on how beauty and artistic value are related, it appears that there might be room for taking different meta-aesthetic stances with respect to these 2 notions as well. So the comparison I'm interested in here is that between moral value and beauty. So the widespread tendency that I have in mind is the tendency to think that realism about what's morally good is more defensible than realism about what's beautiful. And in what follows, I'm going to use the term aesthetic value and beauty interchangeably. Now, most philosophers, in fact, include much more than beauty under the category of aesthetic value. But most of them do take at least beauty to be an example of aesthetic value, albeit not the only one. So I'll be adopting the narrower usage just for ease of reference, but nothing of consequence hinges on this. It's just a purely linguistic decision. So a bit about realism. There's a fair amount of debate about how realism with respect to a given domain should be understood. But that debate is orthogonal to my purposes here. So really, I'm just, for the sake of clarity, just going to tell you how I'll be using the term. So a fairly uncontroversial usage, and the one I'm going to adopt, is as follows. Moral realists think that there are mind-independent moral properties, such as moral goodness and badness, and that our moral claims and judgments are really just attributions of those properties to things, And they're true just when the moral property in question is really had by the thing judged. Realists about beauty, by analogy, think that there's a mind-independent property of beauty, such that our aesthetic judgments are really just claims about whether that property obtains in particular cases. So the asymmetry claim is the claim that the latter position is less defensible than the former. So for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to understand realism to preclude response-dependence accounts, since I'm understanding realism with respect to a given domain to involve the claim that the instantiation of the property in question is a wholly mind-independent matter. So some philosophers use a less stringent definition of realism, according to which some response-dependence accounts at least will qualify as realist. And if you like, you can just hear robust realism when I say realism. Nothing of consequence really hinges on how I'm using the term, but just to be clear, I'm using it in a way that precludes mind-dependent and response-dependence accounts. The asymmetry claim, as I said before, is very rarely stated explicitly. But I think the trend is manifested in claims by moral anti-realists that their theories transfer unproblematically to aesthetics. So Mackie, regarding his moral error theory, and A.J. Ayer about his moral non-cognitivism, they both say, almost as an aside or in a footnote, oh yeah, this is obviously going to apply to aesthetics as well. And interestingly, that trend doesn't happen in the other direction. So moral realists tend not to make statements like that about their realism transferring over to aesthetics. They tend to be a bit more careful. So David Enoch, for example, states very explicitly in his book, Taking Morality Seriously, that it's a further question whether it transfers over to aesthetics, and he expresses some doubt about whether it does. So these I take to manifest this, sort of general tendency to find realism about aesthetics a tougher position to defend than realism about ethics. One rare example of an explicit statement of the asymmetry claim comes from Marsha Eaton, who argues that realism about beauty, if you're going to understand realism here as totally analogous to realism about, say, ethics and matters in science, that position she thinks would be untenable. So she says, scientific realists believe that there are states of the world, and hence facts about the world, and statements describing those states that are true independently of whether anyone believes them. Theorists have described moral realism analogously, and there are such that there are moral truths or facts. These truths or facts are independent of the evidence for them. But, she says, an analogous interpretation of aesthetic realism would require that there be aesthetic facts or truths independent of the evidence for them. Such a strong interpretation has few adherents. For the very meaning of aesthetic terms, she says, carries a subjective element. And so I think the popular view in aesthetics is to hold that a response-dependence account, coupled perhaps with some story about how this can still allow for standards of correctness, is the closest to realism that one can reasonably get with respect to aesthetics. And this is borne out not only in statements such as Eaton's, but also in the fact that variants of the response-dependence view are not only popular in aesthetics, but at least to my knowledge, exhaust the category of accounts that seek to accommodate standards of correctness in aesthetics. People don't go further, in other words, and say that beauty is an entirely mind-independent matter. Okay, so it's perhaps worth clarifying my thesis at this point. So my aim here is not to argue against a response-dependence account for beauty, or indeed to argue that beauty can't be mind-dependent, but rather to raise a challenge for those who argue that it is, without taking the same view of ethical value. So my contention is that the aesthetic is in at least as good a position as the ethical when it comes to realism, or equivalently, the ethical is in at least as bad a position as the aesthetic, however you want to see it. Thus, the arguments I give in this paper could provide the beginnings of a case to argue from moral realism to aesthetic, or alternatively to argue from aesthetic anti-realism to ethical. At the very least, I'm providing a challenge to those who hold the asymmetry view to offer some justification for it, and showing that the differences traditionally appealed to aren't actually up to the task. Okay, so we've noted this general tendency to hold that moral realism is more defensible than realism about beauty, and specifically that it's much harder to maintain that beauty is mind independent and to hold the corresponding thesis about moral goodness and badness. So what grounds this difference in attitude to the two domains? I'm going to discuss two broad types of consideration that have at least sometimes been taken to provide the required justification. So first, in the small number of cases, and it really is a very small number of cases, I think, in which arguments are provided for the asymmetry claim, these very often involve appealing to differences in what's sometimes called the epistemology of aesthetic versus ethical judgments, pointing to a number of restrictions on the conditions under which an aesthetic judgment can be legitimately made. And then pointing out these restrictions don't appear to hold in the case of ethical judgments. So I'm going to look at 3 of these. And a common thought is that taking seriously these kinds of constraints commits us to a picture of aesthetic judgment as tied in some important sense to subjective responses, whilst no corresponding commitment holds in the case of ethical judgment. And this, defenders of the asymmetry claim take to show that aesthetic value must be, in at least some sense, mind-dependent, whilst leaving that analogous question with respect to ethical value still open. So this constitutes the first kind of argument I'll examine. And then in a second kind of case, arguments for the asymmetry claim involve claiming that aesthetic value, but not moral value, is dependent on properties that are themselves mind-dependent, in particular sensory properties. And this, again, is taken to show that aesthetic value must be mind-dependent, whilst leaving open whether ethical value is. So in what follows, I'll examine these arguments, and I'll go through the arguments first, and then I'll come back to each one and say why I think they fail to be persuasive. If the asymmetry claim is justified, then the justification doesn't come from any of these sources. If I'm right, the burden of proof is going to be on those who hold the asymmetry claim to supply a plausible justification for it. So, first claim. I'm calling this claim descriptions. And the claim is, it's perfectly legitimate to make a moral judgment on the basis of a description. If you tell me entirely in non-moral terms that Betty said and did such and such, I can, in principle, be in a position to thereby make a moral judgment about whether what Betty did was morally wrong or not, provided you give me accurate and sufficiently detailed information. But this is often argued is not the case for aesthetic judgments. So no amount of non-aesthetic or non-evaluative descriptions of something will put me in a position to judge whether that thing is beautiful. So that's the first alleged difference. We're going to come back to this later, but for now I'm just going to run through the claimed differences. Second alleged difference I'm calling principles. So this is the claim that aesthetic judgments can't involve the application of principles. Interestingly, those who try to defend the view, and there haven't been very many of them, that aesthetic principles even exist are often described, ironically, as heroic, which is what was said about Monroe Beardsley when he tried to do something similar. In aesthetics, particularism is the mainstream view, and indeed, in his well-known arguments for moral particularism, Jonathan Dancy takes aesthetics to be a domain where particularism is uncontroversially right, and tries to support ethical particularism by drawing an analogy with aesthetics. So in contrast, the view that moral principles play an important part in moral judgments is pretty much the mainstream view, and people like Dancy who deny the role of principles in ethics are in a minority. So these 2 points, descriptions and principles, might be thought to be very closely related, but it's worth noting that they can come apart. So if you can judge on the basis of a description that something's morally wrong or right, it doesn't follow from that necessarily, or it doesn't seem obvious to me to follow from that you're using moral principles. Again, I think even those who argue for moral particularism can acknowledge that moral judgments can be made on the basis of descriptions. It would be bizarre to insist that you had to actually see actions unfold or find out about them in some way other than hearing them described. Right? I might judge that Betty acted wrongly after hearing a faithful, non-moral description of what she did, but that doesn't commit me, I don't think, to any laws linking non-moral properties to moral ones. Okay, so for now, let's move on to the third alleged difference. This I'm calling acquaintance. So a constraint known in aesthetics as the acquaintance principle, some people argue, holds in aesthetics. As we'll see, there's some debate about what exactly the principle amounts to and how it extends beyond certain paradigm cases. But the thought is roughly this. So in order to judge that Betty acted wrongly, I don't need to have been there and have seen her action unfold and observed all the consequences of it for myself and so on. But in the case of my judgment that this garden, a particular garden is beautiful, I do need to see that garden for myself. So that looks like another potential difference between the 2 domains. Now the final difference that I'm going to discuss is what I'm calling dependence. So this is the claim that beauty depends on sensory properties, which are themselves mind-dependent, like colours and so on. So aesthetic properties must be mind-dependent. Moral goodness, on the other hand, does not depend on mind-dependent properties. So these 4 alleged differences, 3 epistemic and 1 metaphysical, cover, I take it, the main reasons people might be inclined to give to defend the asymmetry claim. And I'm going to argue that all of them fail. The asymmetry claim, then, is without support, if I'm right. Or at the very least, defenders of the claim need to face a challenge for saying why they should accept it. So I argue in what follows that while principles might be a genuine difference, descriptions is not. Acquaintance needs further clarification on which it either fails to mark a genuine difference between the ethical and the aesthetic, or it is a genuine difference but not one that supports the asymmetry claim. And dependence, I'm going to argue, is not a genuine difference, nor would it ground the asymmetry claim if it were. So descriptions first. I'm just going to... Good. So the claim, to recap, is that while moral judgments can be legitimately formed on the basis of descriptions, aesthetic judgments cannot. No description of an object will put me in a position to judge that that object is beautiful. The argument is that this restriction on aesthetic judgments is best explained by the claim that aesthetic judgments are essentially tied to subjective responses. The thought is this: if no set of descriptions, no matter how thorough and accurate, can put you in a position to make an aesthetic judgment, this should make you doubt that aesthetic judgments really are a matter of reporting some mind-independent fact. What makes an aesthetic judgment appropriate on the suggested picture is not just the features of the object judged, but certain features of the judging subject, perhaps her subjective response to the object. This argument, I'm going to argue, suffers from 2 defects. So first, the premise about descriptions, even if true, this premise about how aesthetics and ethics differ in terms of what description can do for you, even if that's true, wouldn't actually lend any support to the conclusion about the essential role of subjective responses. And second, I'm going to also argue that the premise is false. So first, a claim that aesthetic judgments can't be made on the basis of descriptions doesn't in fact lend any support to the claim that such judgments essentially involve subjective responses. Why? Because there is no reason to think that being based on a description is any barrier to a judgments essentially involving subjective responses. Some people hold that moral judgments require emotional responses, and these people don't have to deny that moral judgments can be made on the basis of description. Many of the situations that we emotionally respond to, we do so having heard them described rather than actually watching them unfold. So people are often morally upset or outraged by news stories that describe events, even if they haven't had any other way of coming into contact with these events. So given that emotional responses can be had on the basis of descriptions in the moral case, it can't be that ruling out descriptions in the aesthetic case is explained by aesthetic judgments being based on emotional responses. So the descriptions point doesn't lend any support to the claim that aesthetic judgments are tied to emotional responses. There's also reason to doubt that the descriptions claim is even true. So most people hold that the things that can be appropriately judged beautiful are not exhausted by perceptible objects. So proofs, chess moves, and theories are all things that have often been held to be capable of being beautiful. Plausibly, one can judge the beauty of a proof, of a chess move, or of a theory on the basis of a description of it. Indeed, it's not clear, at least in the case of a theory and a proof, it's not clear on what other basis one would be able to make such a judgment other than a description. And if this is right, the descriptions point just doesn't hold for the aesthetic case as a whole. Rather, it only holds for a subset of aesthetic judgments of perceptual beauty. So the descriptions point is not a hallmark of the aesthetic, but of the perceptual. Moreover, I think there's a natural explanation for why this is so, one that crucially doesn't appeal to the role of subjective responses at all. We simply lack the vocabulary to describe the perceptual features of something in the level of detail that would be needed to allow someone to form an opinion of whether it's beautiful. It's not that the descriptions in principle would be an inappropriate basis for an aesthetic judgment. It's rather that the kinds of descriptions that would be needed are simply not available. So the descriptions point then does not, as often claimed, describe a genuine difference between the aesthetic and the moral. The contrast is really between one subset of aesthetic judgments on the one hand and the remaining aesthetic judgments plus all the ethical judgments on the other. Moreover, I think the contrast is not a very deep one. It concerns the availability of adequate descriptions rather than some principled ruling out of descriptions as an appropriate basis for judgment. plausibly, in cases of visual beauty, you need to know what an object looks like in order to know whether it's beautiful. You can't come to know what an object looks like on the basis of a description, and plausibly that's the reason why descriptions aren't going to be able to ground an aesthetic judgment. Okay, so that's the descriptions point. Now for the principles point. I think this is the worst argument, actually. So you might wonder if the principles point is a bit of a straw man, but I put it in anyway because some people do seem to think it. Okay, so lack of a role for aesthetic principles might appear to support the claim that aesthetic judgments essentially involve subjective responses. And here are two reasons to think that it doesn't. So first, people who think that moral judgment doesn't involve principles don't tend to feel compelled towards a view of moral judgment as essentially involving subjective responses. So the best-known advocate of moral particularism, Jonathan Dempsey, is also a moral realist. And unless an argument is given for why moral particularists should be moral anti-realists, or for why the situation is different in the aesthetics case, there doesn't seem to be any reason why a lack of principles should worry the aesthetic realist, or indeed why a role for ethical principles should help the moral realist. So even if it's true that there is more of a role for principles in an ethical judgment than aesthetic, this doesn't help the asymmetry claim. Secondly, and a bit more speculatively, I think that there is more room to argue for the existence and role of aesthetic principles in the non-perceptual cases than in the perceptual ones. So various plausibly non-evaluative criteria are frequently offered for the beauty of theories, for example. So simplicity and ability to explain a wide range of phenomena tend to be appealed to quite a lot when people, are pressed to say what they mean when they talk about a theory as being beautiful. And if this is right, then there might be a further problem with the argument from principles. So just as the descriptions point turned out to be not a feature of the aesthetic but of the perceptual, if the above, if what I've just said is correct, then the principles point may only apply to perceptual aesthetic judgments and not all aesthetic judgments. In which case we may again appeal to our alternative explanation. We don't use aesthetic principles in the perceptual case because we lack the vocabulary in which to couch them. If we already have reason to believe that we lack the vocabulary to describe the perceptual in the requisite level of detail, then it's quite plausible that we would lack the vocabulary to state any principles linking perceptual properties to aesthetic ones. So we just can't even pick out the relevant perceptual properties. If it turns out that aesthetic principles only appear to lack a role in the perceptual cases, then it seems the best explanation for these two things is that we're unable to state any perceptual aesthetic principles, and there are no grounds for concluding that there couldn't possibly be any such principles. And I think also no grounds for concluding that we couldn't possibly be using them, even if we can't articulate them. After all, attempts to identify moral principles in any systematic sense as playing a crucial role in guiding our moral judgments have hardly been a roaring success. So given this, even those who think principles play a role in moral judgments ought to draw a distinction between making use of such principles and being able to articulate them. And once you draw that distinction, it seems we can make use of it in the aesthetic case as well. On the other hand, this is me anticipating a potential counter-argument. You might think that the argument I've just given could be undermined by cases of beautiful literature and beautiful turns of phrase. So these might be examples of non-perceptual beauty where it seems implausible to think that there's principles, however plausible you think it is in the case of theories and proofs. So if that's a genuine worry, then the first point still stands, right? So the point that we've yet to see any reason to think particularism is any obstacle to realism. So again, I think that's enough to show that at least the burden of proof is on the asymmetry theorist to say why we should be worried about the principles case. Okay, so we've discussed the descriptions point and the principles point, and I've argued that neither of these lends any support to the asymmetry claim. Now let's look at the acquaintance point. So as I noted before, it's popular to claim that in the case of aesthetic judgments but not ethical ones, what's known as the acquaintance principle holds. And the thought is something like this. In order to judge that Betty acted wrongly, I don't need to be there and see her action unfold and observe the consequences of her action. But in the case of my judgment that a particular garden is beautiful, I do need to see the garden for myself in order to make that judgment. So some philosophers, most recently McKeever and Ridge, have argued that the fact that this constraint holds in the aesthetic case is best explained by the claim that aesthetic judgments are importantly tied to subjective responses. the reason you need to see the garden for yourself in order to judge it beautiful is that judging something beautiful is a matter of having a certain kind of subjective response to it. The argument is a potential argument for the asymmetry claim, since if the acquaintance principle supports the view that aesthetic value is mind-dependent and the acquaintance principle doesn't hold in the ethical case, this might be the sought-for grounding of the asymmetry claim. This argument, however, is not compelling. So implicit in the argument is the assumption that one couldn't have an emotional response to something if one weren't acquainted with it. Otherwise, why would the need for emotional responses generate a restriction that one must be acquainted with the object? But this assumption is clearly false. You don't need to be acquainted with something in order to have an emotional response to it. You can have an emotional response to, say, an action or a turn of events, as I argued before, that you've only heard described and not witnessed firsthand. So the assumption that one can't have an emotional response to something if one's not acquainted with it is just false. The acquaintance principle's holding for judgments of beauty, then, if it does, is not evidence that emotional responses are necessary for aesthetic judgments, because one can have them to something that one's not acquainted with. So the argument from acquaintance is not successful. So you might wonder, okay, well, what does the acquaintance principle tell us about aesthetic judgments, if it does hold in the aesthetic case and not the ethical? I'm going to argue that whatever the acquaintance principle amounts to, it's a requirement that ultimately hinges on the kind or amount of information needed as a basis for an aesthetic judgment, and not, as has been supposed, on the nature of the judgment itself. And I think something kind of depends on how we understand the acquaintance principle. But in its crudest form, it's something like you need to see the object, or you need to have a perceptual encounter with the object that you're judging in order to judge whether it's beautiful or not. And then I think, well, okay, so that formulation just looks implausible, given that there's these cases of non-perceptual beauty. So that doesn't look like it's going to be something about aesthetic judgments as a whole, but rather just a subset of them. And then we can also, we can appeal to our explanation from before that the reason for this is just going to be that in order to know what something looks like, you need to see it. So if something's beauty hinges on how it looks, you're not going to be able to find out if it's beautiful unless you see it, just because that's the only way to find out how it looks. So that's kind of, it seems easy to deal with the crude rendering of the acquaintance principle. But a lot of philosophers try to come up with a subtler formulation that tries to deal with cases of non-perceptual beauty. So they'll suggest things like, okay, it's not a perceptual encounter that you need with the object in order to judge it beautiful, you need a direct encounter. But then I think, well, what does that mean exactly? What is a direct encounter? What is it to directly encounter a proof? What's being required? What's being ruled out by the acquaintance principle here? And then it seems to me that really all that's required is that you understand the proof and you know what the proof is. And then it seems like, well, really the requirement is just that you need, it's just a requirement concerning the amount of information that you need to have about something in order to judge it aesthetically. And I expect that there'll be some comeback to this, and it'll be interesting to discuss it in more detail in the Q&A. But it seems to me that, the acquaintance principle, however it's formulated, is ultimately going to boil down to a requirement that you just need to have a certain amount of knowledge about the object judged. And indeed, it might turn out that there is a contrast there with the ethical. It might be that you need more knowledge in the aesthetic case about the object judged than you do in the ethical case, perhaps. Some people think that in the ethical case it's easy to know in advance which properties are going to be ethically inert, and that's not the case in aesthetics. But again, these all look to be requirements about the information that you need to have on which to base your judgment. They don't seem to be requirements about the nature of the judgment, and specifically that the judgment is going to be one that involves having a subjective emotional response to something. So that, I take it, it renders the acquaintance claim not a particularly good premise for an argument for the asymmetry claim. Let's look finally then at the dependence claim. So those were the three epistemic kind of requirements, constraints on making aesthetic judgments versus ethical ones. This is more of a metaphysical claim. And the claim here is that beauty depends on sensory properties, which are themselves mind-dependent. So aesthetic properties must be mind-dependent. Moral goodness doesn't depend on mind-dependent properties, so we've got an argument that looks like it's going to ground mind dependence of the aesthetic without pushing us towards mind dependence of the ethical. So the argument in a bit more detail is, I take it, this. Beauty depends on sensory properties such as colours and sounds. Beauty can only be mind independent if colours and sounds are mind independent. From premise 1. Premise 3, sounds and colours are not mind independent, and then we see the kind of familiar arguments for the mind dependence of secondary qualities. So beauty can't be mind independent from premise 2 and premise 3. I'm not going to take issue here with premise 3, because it's just beyond the scope of this paper to enter into the debate about the mind dependence or otherwise of colours and sounds. So just for argument's sake, I'm going to assume that 3 is correct. Nonetheless, there are 2 problems with this argument. So premise 1 I'm going to argue is false, and I think you'll probably be able to see by now why I'm going to say that. Premise 2, perhaps more interestingly, wouldn't follow from premise 1 even if it were true. So 1 is false because, as I argued above, things that have no sensory properties can be beautiful. Proofs, theories, blah, blah, blah. And furthermore, you might think that even things that have sensory properties can be beautiful by virtue of qualities other than those sensory ones. So a book could be beautiful by virtue of what's written in it, not by virtue of any of its sensory properties. But even if none of that were the case, right, so even if premise 1 were true, there's another problem with the argument. The move from 1 to 2 is invalid, I'm going to argue. So suppose that beauty were always bound up with the sensory properties of an object. Even then, it wouldn't follow that realism about beauty can only hold if those properties are mind independent. And I'm going to try and persuade you of this by giving you an analogy. So in many cases, the moral goodness or badness of an act depends crucially on how people were affected by it. So if I make a remark which causes you to feel offended or hurt or upset, and I know that it's going to do that, then presumably this bears on the moral status of my act. So the moral badness of my act is bound up with how you feel about it, and presumably how you feel about it is not a mind-independent matter. It depends on how you feel, and it depends on facts about your mind. Similarly, a factory disposing of waste in a nearby river, which will pose a risk of contamination to the local water supply, let's say, the moral status of this presumably depends, among other things, on facts about humans. It's because humans need clean water, etc. In these cases, the moral badness of the action depends, in at least some part, on facts about humans. So it seems then that far from dependence on mind-dependent properties being a difference between moral and aesthetic value that could ground the asymmetry claim, aesthetic and moral value are on a par in this respect. Unless the asymmetry theorists can point to a relevant difference between the 2 cases here, and I'll be interested if anyone here wants to do that, it seems that dependence of instances of aesthetic value on mind-dependent properties can't ground the asymmetry claim, since such dependence is also exhibited by instances of moral value. So prima facie at least, either this is an obstacle to realism in both cases or in neither. And moreover, I think there are reasons to go with the latter option. Moral realists don't seem to be worried about those kinds of cases, right? It's not going to be news to any moral realist that sometimes the moral badness of someone's action is going to depend on whether someone was hurt or upset by it. That's not the kind of mind dependence, I'm going to argue, that realists are wanting to deny. So the relevant distinction, I think, is between what I'm going to call derivative and non-derivative mind dependence. So a property is derivatively mind dependent, just in case among the properties on which it depends are properties that are themselves mind dependent. And a property is non-derivatively mind dependent, just in case even once the base properties are fixed, which might or might not be a mind dependent matter, there's still a role for what people think in determining whether the object has that property. So what moral realists are really committed to is not that something's being morally good never depends on what anyone thinks, but rather that once the base properties are fixed, there's no role for what people think in determining whether the action is morally good. So, for example, moral realists can allow that whether my action caused pain or injury or offence are questions the answer to which depends on humans, and their thoughts and feelings. What they insist on is that there's no role beyond that for what humans' thoughts and feelings are in determining whether the action is morally good or bad. And equally, what realists about beauty are really committed to, by analogy, is that it's not that something's being beautiful never it's not that something's being beautiful never depends on what anyone thinks or feels, but rather that once the base properties are fixed, which may or may not be a mind-dependent matter, there's no role for what people think and feel in determining whether the object is beautiful. In other words, moral realists and realists about beauty don't need moral goodness and beauty, respectively, to be derivatively mind-independent. They just need it to be non-derivatively mind-independent. And the dependence point is just that beauty is derivatively mind-dependent, but since derivative mind-dependence doesn't entail non-derivative mind-dependence, the dependence point doesn't pose any problem after all for realism about beauty, and thus it can't ground the asymmetry claim. So just to briefly sum up, I've discussed 4 alleged differences between beauty and moral goodness and badness. Descriptions, principles, acquaintance, and dependence, which have been argued or could be argued to support the asymmetry claim. And I've argued that none of them, in fact, lends any support to the asymmetry claim. Only principles straightforwardly picks out a genuine difference between the 2 domains, but it can't ground the asymmetry claim because it provides no obstacle to realism, and the remaining differences, alleged differences, aren't real differences between the 2 domains after all.